Hello everyone, and welcome to our third lecture for week 3. And today we're going to really talk about the assignment. So we're going to have something that I refer to as a colloquy. So basically it's just a discussion about your assignment. Alright, so the assignment of course is up on study desk, and the first question asks you to assume that we are interested in maximizing efficiency, aggregate benefits relative to aggregate costs. So this actually is asking you about the same example that you see on page 13 of your textbook, and it's the same example that we've discussed in lecture 2. So the first question really wants you to run through the same analysis that we did in lecture 2, but in your own words, right? So if you remember in lecture 2 we talked about two possibilities. First was the ability of assigning the right to clean air to the residents. So if I'm the lawmaker, which one of these two laws am I going to choose? Assign the right of clean air to residents, or the second possibility, assign the right to pollute to the factory. Those are the two rules or the two laws, and under each one of these so if you assign clean air to the residents, the factory could choose one of the options, and we said in our analysis in lecture 2 the factory is gonna opt to install the smoke screen, and of course that's also the efficient outcome that we talked about in that lecture. If it's under the second possible rule, where we assign the right to pollute to the factory, then it's the residents who will have to choose one of the options, but they also again choose the smoke screen because it's the most efficient. So well, they choose the smoke screen because it's the least cost to them, but it also happens to be the efficient outcome in this scenario. Alright, so what you need to do for our assignment for part 1.1 on the question 1 is just simply to rehash these possibilities. So explain in your own words what happens if we choose the first rule, what happens if we choose the second rule, and what would be the outcome in each under each policy. So when we talk about the policy, it's policy 1 of assigning the right to clean air to the residents, policy 2 assigning the right to pollute to the factory. Now under 1.2 it asks you which of the two policies or policy choices would the factory choose. If you were the factory, which one of these policies you would be better off under? And the same thing for the residents. So here you have to think basically about who's paying for what. If we choose the policy of assigning clean air, the right to clean air to the residents, okay, who's going to be paying here? It's the factory who's going to incur this amount of $150 to install the smoke screen. What about under the second policy? If we assign the right to pollute to the factory, who's going to be paying now? The residents will have to pay for the smoke screen with the same amount. So based on that, which one of these two policy choices or rules or laws the factory would be happier under? The factory would want which one of these, and the residents would want which one of these. So this is just a hint to get you started to think about things beyond efficiency and more towards equity. And this will also be relevant in the last question of your assignment, assignment 1, because there you will have to talk explicitly about the problems actually with the cost theorem. Alright, so let's then move to question 2. Here we'll have a different setup. Instead of looking at efficiency, we want to look at wealth maximization. So in your assignment handout you find that I've worked out an example. There's a curved ball in that example. We'll explain that in a minute, but that's how you want to calculate relative wealth, and then you want to maximize that wealth under each one of these two policies that we'll talk about. So again, the same two policies from the previous question, from question 1. So the first question here asks you to identify the maximum relative wealth under each choice and under each policy intervention. So you're going to look again under the first policy intervention of clean air to the residents, and the second policy intervention of pollution to the factory. Under each one of these, as you know, there are three choices. So under the first policy, there will be three choices that the factory has to make, and then the decision is for the residents under the second policy. And all you need to do now is to work out these relative wealth maximization calculations. In the second question, it says which of the two policy choices would the factory choose? So the same thing as we asked in the first question. After you have done your calculations, which of the policy choices is better for the factory, which is better for the residents? Okay, let's have a look first at how we are gonna calculate these wealth maximization or relative wealths. So the first thing we're going to do again is to look at the right to clean air that goes to the residents, and the factory will have the same choices that we had in our lecture 2 and in question 1. The first, of course, option is to pollute and pay $375 in damages. The second is to install the smoke screen for $150, and the last is to purchase 5 dryers for the residents at a total cost of $250. Now, under the first option, the first option, which is to pollute and pay $370 in damages, what's going to happen to the wealth of the factory? Now, we assume that the factory is going to have a revenue of $500. Now, when you pay $375, it's going to come out of those $500, which means that you are left only with $125. What about the residents? So the first bracket here, this is how you want to represent these in your assignment. This first bracket here is simply, this one here is simply the payoff, as they call it in game theory, the payoff that accrues to the factory. What about for the residents? This is the second entry here. So it's a pair of two numbers. The first number is the one for the factory, the second number is the one for the residents. The second pair, which is the one for the residents, will reflect the fact that they are suffering damage of $375, but now they also receive $375 from the factory, which means that they cancel out. That's not exactly what you have in your assignment, because the handout wanted you to really think of how you're going to treat the damages. So in the handout, you only see that they get $375. So it's a positive $375 for the second number in this bracket, in this pair. But then you have to think about how you're going to add the damages. Where do they accrue, and how do you add them to this calculus, to this calculation? So this is how I want you to do it for the assignment. Moving forward, you will use this pair of 125 and 0 for the first option, and then the same thing you're going to do for the options B and C. So if they install a smoke screen, it's going to be $500. Why doesn't the revenue change? Because this $150 is going to be spent on an asset, so it's like a capital expenditure, so it's still part of their wealth. So the money did not go out, they simply just exchange cash for an asset. So it's still $500, and the residents still get nothing. Now, of course, they're going to get 0 because there are no damages anymore. It's not going to be negative $375. It's simply 0 because there are no damages. Same thing with the third option, where the factory purchases the 5 dryers for the residents. So now they have to pay $250 that goes outside the factory. So they lose that money basically, and their wealth goes down by $250. And that $250 goes to the residents. So now they have an asset of $250 collectively as 5 residents, and there are no damages because their washing is inside, and we said that these damages from the smoke will accrue only to the laundry. Alright, so this is how you want to calculate these 3 sets of payoffs for the factory and for the residents. And the question now is, which one of these 3 is the factory going to choose? If you were the factory, you want to maximize your relative wealth vis-a-vis or in relation to the residents. So in the first option, you will be up by 125. So you have more wealth than residents by 125. In the second option, you have more wealth than residents by 500. In the third option, you don't have any wealth above and beyond what the residents have. You simply have exactly the same wealth. So this would be, of course, the least attractive option for the factory. So your job then in this assignment is to decide which one of these would the factory choose if they want to maximize their relative wealth, i.e. their wealth compared to the residents. Now, the second policy where the factory has the right to pollute, you find that the residents have again three options, and you have to go through the calculations, and you see here the three sets of payoffs that you should arrive at. So I'm giving that to you, but then your job is to argue which one of these three sets would the residents choose if they want to maximize their relative wealth compared to the factory. As you can see, that this is all negative for the residents, but they still want to minimize the distance or the difference between them and the factory. Alright, we'll leave it there. The third question now asks you to look at what happens if we look at the problem as if the factory is owned by the 5 residents. So there is no factory and residents anymore. It's just one entity that owns the factory, and that factory is owned by these residents. How would that change our wealth maximization calculations in question 2? And again, what would the factory choose? What would the residents choose? Of course, this second question, 3.2, is a very simple question, because now the choice is going to be the same since the factory and the residents are the same entity. So we'll see that also in the calculations. Again, you'll go through the first policy, and the factory residence now is one entity and it's going to choose. Okay, so again you have the three calculations. So your job is to understand why these are the calculations here. So the first one says you pollute and pay 375 in damages. So the factory residence is going to pollute, and now of course this money is going to come out from the factory. So it's going to end up with $125. Why is it $125? So if they pay the 375, they're going to pay it to whom? See, is it going to be paid to themselves, or is it going to go to cover damages that already accrued? You see. Then the second one is to install a smoke screen. It doesn't change much. It's still the 500 because you're simply changing something from cash to an asset, and the same thing for the third option. And the second policy is also the same, and you have to think why it's exactly the same as the previous one. You see, now there is no difference at all between the two policies at every choice of option. So the same options are exactly the same, or the options are exactly the same under both policies, which is not surprising because now you have only one entity. The factory and the residence are the same. Maybe then you can build on this point in the last question when you want to talk about the issues, at least some of the issues with the cost theorem. Now the last question is again just to explain the cost theorem in your own words. So we have talked about it previously in the previous lectures, but I want you to really maybe do some research online. So go a little bit beyond the textbook and look at how you can explain the cost theorem, maybe different versions of the cost theorem and its limitations. Remember, this is a 10-mark question, so you have to put some effort in really delineating what the cost theorem is and then what its limitations are. Alright, so I hope with this you are well set now to start working on the assignment, and as usual what I call a formative assessment. So from now until the submission date, which is the 19th of December, you're most welcome to email me or to discuss this either on your own study groups. Some of you have suggested Skype or maybe even Facebook, but of course I'm also available if you want to email me and discuss this, or if you even want to discuss it on any of the forums that we have on StudyDesk. Alright, we'll leave it there, and I'll talk again to you soon.